there's a classical theory of categories that again comes from Aristotle, and it says that a category is defined by a set of features, a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. That is, a list of properties, and that everything is either in the category or out of a category, and that the defining features are what is called the essence of this category. This is a classical theory. It's been around for over 2,500 years, and it doesn't work. Unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice if it worked, but it's not true. First, there are many concepts that are graded, that have degrees, like tall. You can be, I'm short, so other people are tall. And there are words called hedges that change the degree of tallness. So you can say he's pretty tall, somewhat tall, very tall, not very tall, and so on. And these hedges depend upon the category being defined by gradations. So when a category is defined by gradations, it's not something that you're either in or out. You can be tall to some degree, and or rich to some degree. What that means is that the classical theory just doesn't work for any category like that. You need some theory of graded categories. And in these cases, there are categories, for example, if you take something like tall, there's some people who are just obviously tall. Yao is tall, right? No question, right? Number one, tall. So it's not the case that everything is between 0 and 1. Some things are tall, and some people are not tall. Now, so that one problem with that is you need to extend the theory of categories to include graded categories. But in addition, there were discovered in the 1970s by a woman named Eleanor Rosch, a very famous professor, one of my colleagues at Berkeley, a phenomenon called prototypes. And she discovered that there are cases where there are gradations of membership in a category. Even if the category does have strict boundaries, there are better and worse examples of the category. She did some famous experiments, a set of about 15 experiments. Let me give you an example of one. She said, look, if you have a notion of a bird, some birds are more bird-like than other birds. So a penguin is not a very bird-like bird. And so what she did was this. She set up an experiment where she would test time reactions. So in a reaction time experiment, you flash on a sentence, and you're supposed to push the button true or false. So the first sentence comes on. It says, a cow is a bird. You press false. Okay? No problem. It comes on and it says, a sparrow is a bird. True. Comes on, a chicken is a bird. You go, true. Right? A pelican is a bird. And you go, true. And they measure the time. And what they find is that there's a gradation of times. And this gradation of times fits the judgments of how close something is to a typical bird. So a typical bird might be a little songbird, like a sparrow. In America, we have robins that are songbirds. But a small songbird is more of a typical bird. A vulture is not a typical bird. It's further down the scale. A pelican is less of a typical bird. A penguin is way down, not a very typical bird. A bat is not a bird at all, but it's sort of like a bird. Okay. And what you find is that even though there's birds and non-birds, and there is a boundary of the category, that really isn't the bird, but it's like a bird in some ways. Even though there's a boundary, there's a degree of membership, a degree to which something is like the typical case. So you have a notion of a typical case of a bird and degrees to which something is like a typical case. So gradedness can combine with typicality. Now, typicality is actually used in reasoning. So there's a famous experiment in which let me give you an example. A duck is not quite a typical bird, right? It's not, atypical. It's sort of in the middle. Yeah? Now, if the experiment went like this. They gave subjects a bunch of questions, and one question said there was a certain island where all of the sparrows got an illness. Would you expect the ducks to get that illness? Okay? Most people said yes. Then there's another set of subjects who got the question. There was a certain island where all the ducks got a certain illness. Would you expect the sparrows to get that illness? Many fewer people said yes. Right? That is, the inference goes from the typical to the non-typical, but not from the non-typical to the typical. So you reason based on these scales of typicality. So that's reasoning goes from typical to non-typical. Okay? And that's one of the functions of typical cases. Now, further study by linguists showed that there were more kinds of prototypes. For example, there's an ideal case prototype that is different from a typical case prototype. It's easy to see. Think of the difference between, or all the women in the audience. What is the difference between a typical husband and an ideal husband? Are they the same? Very different. Right? You have different prototypes, and you reason about them differently. Okay? For example, if you are looking for a husband, you might rate people based on your ideal, not on the typical case. That is, you're looking for some ideal, and you're rating it on an ideal case. However, what do you think about typical cases? It says, if you meet somebody who is just married to someone, what would you expect about their husbands to be like? They'd be more like a typical husband, right? There's given no other information, it's like that. And the same thing is like buying a car. Suppose you want to buy a used car, an old car, okay? There's a typical old car, an ideal old car, and a terrible old car. The terrible old car it has a special name in English. There are two names. One name is a lemon. There's another that's a junker. These are, nightmare cases. Okay. Now you have four categories that are important: typical prototypes, ideal prototypes, nightmare prototypes. Right? There's a word in English for the nightmare cases. There's an expression, from hell. The used car from hell. The boyfriend from hell. Okay? These are the nightmare cases. And you judge people. When you go to buy a car, you want to avoid the nightmare case, look for the ideal case, and expect the typical case. Okay? Try to judge those. So what happens is that you have, when you learn an important category, you learn a very complicated structure in that category. You learn typical cases, ideal cases, nightmare cases, and you use them for different kinds of reasoning. You think about them and reason about them for different purposes. and this is normal for just about every important category we have. Now, this fact contradicts Aristotle's view of categories. Aristotle said, in a category, all members of the category are equal. They're all the same. They either have the essence or they don't have the essence. They have the defining properties or they don't, and that's the end of the story. It's a false story. Most categories are characterized in this way. Now, it turns out that there are other categories. There are categories that can be defined instantaneously. I can make up a category, and you will be able to think, given your knowledge about all of these things, you will be able to impose a structure like this. For example, suppose I make up the category, things you take on a picnic. Right? All right, you don't take a bear on a picnic, or an elephant on a picnic. You might take a little dog on a picnic. Probably not a cat, and so on. There are things that you would take on a picnic. You would take a bottle of tea on a picnic, and so on. You would know, given certain examples, you'd know what you would take on a picnic and what would be typical, what would be ideal for a picnic, what would be disastrous for a picnic. And you can make this up immediately for a new category, if you have the right knowledge. Okay? Can you all hear me in back? Is that clear? Now, there are other kinds of prototypes that are very important. These are the special case prototypes. They're cases, they're called salient exemplars. Salient exemplars, a terrible technical term that only a psychologist could make up. This is, let me give you an example. Take the category terrorist attack. Okay? The salient exemplar would be 9/11. Right? It's the most famous, the ones that would come to mind immediately. And what happens with salient exemplars is very interesting. People judge probabilities based on salient exemplars. So we had a terrorist attack in America, 9/11, and now that has become the salient exemplar of a terrorist attack. As a result, all over America, people worry about 9/11 type attacks. In the middle of cornfields in Iowa, people worry about terrorists crashing airplanes into their houses. I mean, completely irrational. There's no probability that this will happen. They give, in the middle of Ohio, in the Midwest, 1,000 miles from any interesting big city, any important city, people want to have masks to protect them from biological warfare. Right? So what happens is that the salient exemplar increases the probability that people will understand their lives in terms of that exemplar. Okay? People use probability judgments based on that. And this has been studied a great deal. So those are some of the cases of prototypes. Now, there's another really, really important case of prototypes. And that is that what I'll call radial categories, central cases and non-central cases. Take the category mother. Okay? Simple category, mother. Now, a mother is defined by many frames. We talked yesterday about frame semantics. And the notion mother is defined by many frames. One frame is the birth frame. The person who birth is the mother, the other person is the child. Okay, the baby. Okay? So you have mother and child. That's one frame. But there are other frames. For example, the marriage frame. The wife of your father is your mother. Okay? That's another frame. There's a frame of genetic inheritance. The female who you get half of your genes from is your mother. Okay? There is a nurturance frame. The woman who raised you is your mother. Let's call that the nurturance frame. Now, normally, all of these frames come together. So if you say, my mother is coming to visit me, you would expect it to be the person who gave birth to you, the person who you get genetic traits from, the person who raised you, and the wife of your father. Right? But the world is more complicated than that. Right? There are stepmothers because of divorce and death and so on. So there are stepmothers, and stepmothers didn't give birth to you, don't get genetic traits from them, but they raised you. Right? There are, now that we have the possibility of egg implantation and so on, there can be a notion of a birth mother that is not a genetic mother. So that you can have a genetic mother, the person you get the egg from, and the birth mother, the person who gives birth to you, who may not be the person who raises you. You may hire someone to be a birth mother, then she hands over the child, and then you have a nurturant mother. So there are different kinds. If you can separate these things out, and we now have in English, because of the technology, expressions not only like stepmother, but birth mother, genetic mother, surrogate mother. A surrogate mother is somebody who is paid to give birth to the child, even though she may not contribute the egg and may not raise the child. She just, gives birth. Now, what's interesting about this is the following. Normally, when you apply an adjective to a category, all the properties of the category hold, plus the properties of the adjective. So if you say, he's a rich man, he's a man and he's also rich. Okay? Or she's an intelligent woman. She's a woman and she's also intelligent. Right? But if you say, she's a birth mother, she doesn't have all the properties of a mother, she only gave birth. Right? That is, you have fewer of the frames hold, not all of the frames. So this is what we call a radial category. In the central case, think of a wheel with spokes. In the central case, all of the frames hold. You have birth and genetics and nurturance and so on. And then, with certain modifiers, you can pick off one of these frames, or two or three, and they can go off from the center. And you can have various concepts of mothers, lots of them, generated from the center with various possibilities. And special words like birth and surrogate to tell you which of the possibilities they are. Right? This does not fit the ordinary theory of modification. The ordinary theory of adjectival modification says the adjective just adds a property to the noun. Whereas these cases, they in fact subtract models. They pick out some models and ignore others. So it's a very important thing to notice how that works, and to notice that the category mother is not an Aristotelian category. It is a radial category. Okay? Now, we'll talk about other radial categories in a while, but I wanted to just get this started, to give you the idea that there are such things. They're extremely important. Now, there's another kind of prototype, a last one I'll talk about. And this is a frame-based prototype. Okay? So, for example, think of the prototype of the word bachelor. What is the frame for the word bachelor? Now, normally, a word like bachelor in English refers to a male of marriageable age who is not married and is eligible to be married. Okay? So a male eligible to be married who is not married. is the usual case. Now, and those properties form a frame for bachelor. But now there are tricky cases. Suppose you think of an Arab sheikh who has only 3 wives but can have 4. Is he an eligible bachelor? He's eligible to be married. You know, it's not so clear. That is, this is a variant on the frame. You know, in some respects he's a bachelor, in some ways he's not. He's not clearly a bachelor, but it's a variant on the frame because the frame was not made up for Arab sheiks. Okay? And we have, or take another example, the Pope. Is the Pope a bachelor? Well, he's never been married, right? But, you know, is he really eligible to be married? Well, not really. You know, possibly, you know, he could quit the church to get married, you know, but it's sort of odd to call the Pope a bachelor, but in some ways he's a bachelor. So he's another in-between case. So what you have are gradations based on variations on a frame. And the reason is that the frames don't always fit reality. Frames are cases that are made up. They're idealized, what we call idealized cognitive models. They're made up, they're mental models, but they don't always fit reality. And we have words, and we can ask questions. Is he a bachelor or is he not a bachelor? And that question presupposes a strict division. But the strict division is false in terms of reality. The strict division may be defined by fitting the frame completely or not fitting it completely. But when you try to fit a frame to reality, it may only hold partially. Okay? And that gives you another kind of prototype. Every frame defines a prototypical case of whatever it is, and non-prototypical cases are cases that partly fit the frame. Okay? So that is the story on prototypes. There are many types, there's not just one. You use them in reasoning, in categorization, and so on, and they're very important for many, many things. Why is this philosophically important? It's philosophically important because classical semantics, formal semantics, if you take a course in formal logic or what is called formal semantics, it will assume that a property or a category is defined by a set of things. But a set is defined as something that is, we remember, is either in a set or out of a set, but there's no prototype properties. Sets do not have prototypes. Sets do not have any of the properties we just discussed. So that a set theoretical semantics, which is what most of the books on semantics are in a generative tradition. In the generative tradition, they use formal semantics. They can't account for any of the phenomena we just discussed. None of them. They are not discussed in textbooks on formal semantics because they cannot be handled by formal semantics. Right? So this is an extremely important thing. If you go out and you look at many linguistics departments, they'll have courses in semantics, and they will be formal semantics, logical semantics, and they will miss all of the cognitive phenomena we've just discussed. One of the reasons why I became a cognitive linguist was in order to discuss these phenomena. Okay, let's move on. I want to tell you a little about how I started working on conceptual metaphor. This is a true story. In 1978, I was teaching an undergraduate seminar with 5 students. At the time, I was interested in what it was called an art form in America called performance art, and I was giving an undergraduate seminar in performance art and linguistics. And in there we went through various topics, reading papers on those topics. And on the day that we were to read a paper on metaphor, it was a very cold, rainy day. We all sat around a little table. There were 5 students. And one woman in the class came in a little bit late, and it was raining, so she was all wet, and she was crying. Okay? And we tried not to notice that she was crying, which was difficult because she was sitting at the table right here. Okay? Right there. And, so we went on with the class, and I said, well, okay, on page so-and-so, Professor so-and-so claims the following. What do you think of this? We go look around the room. We all look at her, and she says, I can't do this today. I've got a metaphor problem with my boyfriend. And she looks around and she says, maybe you can help. Well, this was Berkeley in 1970s. We said, of course. We formed what was called a little group for group therapy. And we said, okay, tell us your problem. She said, well, on the way to class, I was walking with my boyfriend, and he said something that upset me. He said that our relationship had hit a dead-end street. A dead-end street. Right? And he said, I don't really understand this very well. Maybe you can help me understand it. So we said, look, if it's hit a dead-end street, you can't keep going the way you've been going. You may have to turn back. And then we realized that English had a lot of expressions in which love was seen as a kind of journey. So, for example, you could say of a love relationship, it's been a long, bumpy road. You could say things like, we're going in different directions. We're at a crossroads in the relationship. You could say the marriage is on the rocks. It's off the track. We're spinning our wheels. And even an airplane image, we may have to bail out. Take a parachute. Now, and by the way, being a linguistics professor, I dutifully wrote down all of these expressions. We made a list. And I said, gee, this is an interesting list, Is there a generalization about this list? That's the question a linguist would ask. What is the generalization here? And we looked at this list and we said, well, in every case, love is seen as a journey. The lovers are the travelers. Okay? Well, what is the love relationship? The love relationship is the vehicle. Sometimes it's a car, sometimes a boat when you're on the rocks, a train when you're off the track, a plane when you're bailing out, but some kind of vehicle. Okay? So love relationship is a vehicle. Write down love relationship, vehicle. What about this journey? Where are you going? Well, you have common life goals. And the common life goals are the destinations that you're trying to reach in this journey. Common destinations. So, common life goals, destinations. Okay? And what about why do you keep hitting dead-end streets and spinning your wheels? Well, these are difficulties in a journey. So, it turns out that difficulties in the love relationship are difficulties in the journey. That is, they're impediments to travel. They're things that keep you from getting to where you want to go. So you're spinning your wheels, you go on the rocks, etc. Okay, so we write these down and they're completely systematic. They look like almost a mathematical mapping. Okay? And you say, gee, that's very interesting. We have this generalization that looks like a mathematical mapping about these different expressions. And the woman says, I don't care about your generalization. My boyfriend is breaking up with me. She said, he's thinking in terms of this metaphor. So I said, gee, that's interesting. How can you think in terms of a metaphor? I mean, the classical theory of metaphor doesn't talk about thinking in terms of a metaphor. How does this work? So we looked at a case. We said, okay, let's suppose you take something like, we're spinning our wheels in this relationship. What do we know about spinning the wheels? Well, there's an image. The image is that there's a car, and the wheels are turning. Is the car moving? The car is not moving. It's stuck. It's stuck in America. The term spinning your wheels applies to a case where the car is not moving. It's stuck in ice or sand or snow or something like that. The wheels are digging in, and the more you turn them, the more they dig in. Okay? So in this case, what you have is the vehicle is not moving. You put a lot of energy into getting it moving. You're trying to rock the car, move it, or get the wheels going, and so on. And you feel frustrated. Okay? Now, what about in a love relationship? When you say we're spinning our wheels in this relationship, it means the relationship is not going anywhere. No progress toward common life goals. Secondly, it means you're putting a lot of energy. You want it to go somewhere. You're putting energy into it, and you feel frustrated. That is the reasoning that you do about travel is being mapped onto the reasoning you do about love via this mathematical mapping that covers our travel, the vehicle is the relationship, and so on. So the idea here is that to understand the use of dead-end street, which means that you can't keep going the way you've been going. You have to do something else, either give up the relationship or turn and go some other direction. Okay? You have to do something else. That is the inference. There's an inference. It's said for a reason. It's said for that reason. Now, these, by the way, she did not make up with her boyfriend. But she found somebody else later on. She got a job, she got her PhD, she got married to a very nice man, and she's fine. In fact, she's a chairman of a department. Now, what is interesting about this is the following. First, when I went to high school, I learned a definition of metaphor, and it came from Aristotle. Aristotle, back 2,500 years ago, said that a metaphor is a matter of words. It's a word used not in its normal sense, but in an unusual, abnormal sense. Secondly, that it's based on similarity, that it's used mainly in poetry or rhetoric, in special rhetorical situations, it is not the usual kind of language. It is not typical language at all. But it's useful to see similarities. Okay? It turns out that he was wrong. First of all of the expressions we saw are cases where the metaphor is not in the words. There are lots of different words, spinning your wheels, off the track, going in different directions, lots of different words. The generalization, the metaphorical generalization, is the mapping, is the relationship between love and travel, which is that travelers map onto lovers, that vehicles map onto relationships, that destinations map onto common life goals, that impediments to travel map onto difficulties, That is the generalization over all of the expressions, and that is what the conceptual metaphor is. And it is that mapping that allows you to reason about love using reasoning about travel. It allows you to reason about one domain, love, in terms of another familiar domain where you understand the reasoning patterns. Okay? Notice that love and travel are not similar in themselves. The metaphor is not based on similarity. Very important. It is not based on similarity. It is not in the words. It is in the concepts. And notice, in each case you have a frame. Frame of travel being mapped onto love. Okay? In each case you have two domains, a complex structure given by a frame, and a mapping of more than one element onto another element. Right? That's what a conceptual metaphor is. And we'll now then ask, how does this work in poetry and so on? We'll get to that in a while. Now, notice why Aristotle gave the definition he gave. He had to. Aristotle was the inventor of logic, and his logic assumed that the logic of the mind was the logic of the world, and that categories were defined by essences, and that if you had a word and that words fit categories, and if the word did not fit its usual category, the only explanation he could give is in terms of similarities of properties. And that's all he had. So he was forced to give that definition. And it's false. He gave an incorrect theory. Now notice the issue of definition. Definitions are not the issue here. Aristotle actually gave a theory of a phenomenon. He observed that people used these things they called metaphors, and what he did was give a theory. He said, it occurs in this kind of language, it's about words, it's based on similarity. Okay, that's a theory. That theory came to be taken as a definition, but it wasn't. It was a theory, and it was an incorrect theory. And it appears now that we've looked at not just the data on love, but thousands of other metaphors, that they all work, that they involve mappings from one domain to another. It's a different theory. Okay? And we'll go through more of that today. But it's important if someone says, I learned the definition of the term metaphor when I was in high school, and this does not fit it. It's wrong. You didn't learn a definition, you learned a theory, and it was a false theory. Okay? Now, why is this important? First, in terms of philosophy and semantics, it's vitally important. If semantics is taken as, if meaning is taken as the relationship that you find in formal semantics between symbols and the world, there is no room for metaphor. Because metaphors are in your mind. Where are those mappings? They're not just out there in the world. You know, it's not in the world, independent of people, that love is a journey. It's the way people understand it. Okay? The metaphors, those mappings are in your mind. They're not in the world. And that means to understand the meaning of expressions like we're spinning our wheels in this relationship, or we're going in different directions, or it's been a long bumpy road. If you want to understand those, you cannot do it in a classical theory of formal semantics. You just cannot. It doesn't work. Okay? Because the classical theory is disembodied. It's just in the relationship between words and the world. It has nothing to do with cognition. Okay? Now, Aristotle also claimed that metaphor was special and poetic, that it was not ordinary everyday language. But the expressions I just gave you are ordinary everyday English. It's a common English expression to say something like, we're going in different directions. It's been a long, bumpy road. That's not poetic. You don't have to be a poet to say this. It's not political rhetoric or anything like that. It's normal discourse. So, metaphor is a normal mode of thought, as we will see. Completely normal. In some cases, even universal. Okay? But normal. All right. Next, it's important because of what is called the distinction between literal meaning and non-literal meaning. There's a tradition in semantics of what is called literal meaning. And literal meaning is based on the old theory of meaning, where the words are supposed to fit the world, literally. That literal meaning has to do with the way words conventionally in your language are taken to fit the world. Now, and anything else is a matter of rhetoric, indirect speech, and so on. So if you use an indirect speech act, if I say something like, it's cold in here, to mean close the window, I'm not just being literal about it, I'm meaning close the window. Okay? So there, that's taken as non-normal, not quite literal meaning. However, the distinction between literal meaning and non-literal meaning breaks down in the case of metaphor, conceptual metaphor. That is, and the reason is this. The other part of the notion of literal meaning, besides fitting the world, is that it's ordinary everyday language. So the idea is ordinary everyday language fits the world. Okay? Here we have ordinary everyday language which is metaphorical, which doesn't just fit the objective world, it has to do with your mind. But then there's a further question. Can the metaphor be appropriate? Is it appropriate? And this is the question, in fact, that student brought up. One of her reactions when we figured all these things out was about the dead-end street was, gee, I really wanted it to go into the relationship to go into another dimension, like the fifth dimension. You know? That is, she didn't want that metaphor to hold. She thought the metaphor was inappropriate. But there are people for whom a relationship is a matter of finding common life goals and reaching them, and then this metaphor might be appropriate for them. It might not be appropriate for someone else. Right? So metaphors can be appropriate or not. And when they are appropriate, then we can say that certain sentences are true or false. That is, it can be a long, bumpy road. It could be true that you're going in different directions if you both understand the relationship in that way. So what we're going to see is that metaphors can be appropriate or inappropriate, that they may be true in certain cases and completely inappropriate in other cases, neither true nor false, or false in other cases. And this is a whole new domain of semantics. The notion of literal meaning, if you ask, is it literally true? Is it literal to say it's been a long, bumpy road in this relationship? Well, it's an ordinary, everyday expression. It may be true, but it doesn't quite fit an objective world, but it does fit the world the way the lovers understand it, and that's perfectly reasonable. That may be sufficient for it to be appropriate. So the issues brought up by the theory of conceptual metaphor are way beyond the issues brought up in formal semantics. There are different questions that are brought up. You have to think about meaning in a different way. Right? And you can't accept the old philosophy. You can't accept the correspondence theory of truth that says truth is the relationship between the words and the world, because it doesn't work that way for metaphor. There can be truth, but you've got to think very carefully about what it means for a metaphor to be true or not true or inapt or not appropriate and so on. So all of semantics becomes much more interesting, much more complicated, but entirely different than it was before. Okay? Now, let's take some other cases. After I discovered this, I started looking for other cases. I asked, how many of these are there? And we now have one. There can't just be 10. There've got to be a lot of them. How many? So far we have found hundreds. We suspect there are thousands. They're just all over. As soon as you start noticing them, they're everywhere. So what I'd like to do now is try to give you some sense of how common these are, and then some sense of their properties. For example, there's a general metaphor that more is up and less is down. Okay? Prices rise, they fall, they skyrocket, and so on. So more is up and less is down. And if you take a copy of Metaphors We Live By and you go through in here in, one of these early chapters, there's a long list of up and down metaphors. So, okay, here you go. Lots of up and down metaphors. Happy is up, sad is down. So I'm feeling up today. My spirits rose. I'm depressed. I'm feeling down. Okay? Happy is up, sad is down. He's really low. He fell into a depression. That boosted my spirits. Okay? So happy is up, sad is down. Why is happy up and sad down? Because there's a physical basis of this. When you feel happy, you're smiling, you feel erect, your muscles are up, and so on. And that's true around the world. When you feel depressed, you're drooping. Okay? And there's a reason for this. It's been observed by Paul Ekman, who studies the physiology of emotions, that this is true in all cultures around the world. It's a human universal about emotions and the body. Okay? And when you have this correlation, you learn happy is up and sad is down. Conscious is up, unconscious is down. You say, get up, wake up, I'm up already. He rises early in the morning. Or he fell asleep. He dropped off to sleep. He's under hypnosis. He sank into a coma. So conscious is up, unconscious is down. Health and life are up, sickness and death are down. He's at the peak of health. Lazarus rose from the dead. He's in top shape. He fell ill. He's sinking fast. He came down with the flu. He's declining. He dropped dead. He dropped. He may not have fallen. He dropped dead. Okay? Physical, having control is up. Being under control, notice, under control is down. So, I'm on top of the situation. He's in a superior position. He's at the height of his power, in the high command, the upper echelon. His power rose. He is under my control. He fell from power. His power is on the decline. He's my social inferior. He's low man on the totem pole, and so on. So you get lots and lots of these. I won't go through all of them in here, but like good is up and bad is down. Things are looking up. Right? We hit a peak last year, but it's been downhill ever since. Things are at an all-time low, and so on. Good is up, bad is down. Now, one of the things that you learn from this right away is that there are many metaphors, and the metaphors are in the conceptual system, and a single word like up can be used for different metaphors. And that the word can be metaphorically ambiguous. So, let me give you an example. If I say, I have a sentence like, it's all downhill from here, in English, it's all downhill from here, it is ambiguous. It could mean things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. Or there's another metaphor, and we'll go over it in a while, and that is one in which actions are motions, and ease of action is ease of motion, and going down. So you could say, for example, how is your dissertation going? And you say, well, it's an uphill climb, meaning it's hard. Or you could say it's all downhill from here, meaning it's easy. So it's all downhill from here could either use the idea that action is motion and downhill motion is easier than uphill motion, or it could mean good is up, bad is down. In fact, they could have almost opposite meanings. So the metaphor is not in the words. The metaphor is not in the sentence. The metaphor is in the conceptual mapping on which the sentence is based. Okay? That is a very important thing to learn. The metaphor is not in the words. People are thinking of saying, that's a metaphorical sentence, as if the metaphor were in the words of the sentence. The words of the sentence evoke an understanding. They evoke a conceptual understanding. That conceptual understanding itself can be metaphorical. And a metaphorical sentence evokes a metaphorical understanding. Okay? Now, these are totally different ideas from the Aristotelian notion. They're completely different from what you would learn in a course in formal semantics. Right? There is nothing like this in formal semantics. Right? In order to think about metaphorical semantics, you have to change your brain. Right? You have to think very differently, and you have to forget lots of things you were taught. Right? Like, for example, metaphors are in the words. Okay? So, I'm going to let that sink in for a minute, and then I want to talk about some other cases. First, there are lots and lots of examples. And some of the most profound examples are very deep, and they have to do with the most basic concepts that we have. Take the notion of time. It turns out that there are various metaphors for time, not just in English, but in many languages. Some of them appear to be universal. Some are not universal. But let me give you an example of this. There is a metaphor for time in which times are moving objects that are coming toward me. All right? The observer, who's here, and the times are going this way. The future is ahead, the past is behind. Now, in Chinese, sometimes it's up and down. We'll talk about that in a minute. In English, it's not. In English, it's the future is ahead, the past is behind. and you don't think about the past as being up, which you might in Chinese. So languages differ with respect to these. And not only that, there are languages where the future is behind and the past is ahead. Okay? It's very interesting. There's my colleague Rafael Nunez has been studying languages in the Andes Mountains in Peru and Chile. And there he finds languages in which the past is ahead because you can see it happen. And the future is behind because you can't see it. And so when they say things like, it happened long ago, they point ahead. Right? There's lots of videotapes of people talking about, this happened 2 years ago, and then this happened longer ago. And they go further into the, further ahead. Okay? But in English, the future is ahead, the past is behind. So we have expressions like, let's put that all behind us. Look at what's ahead of us. He's forward-looking. Okay? Now, given that the future is ahead and the past is behind, you then have further metaphors. Times and events are associated with times. Times can be coming towards you. Okay? So you can say things like, Christmas is coming. It's coming up on me. Christmas is here. Christmas has passed. Right? Christmas is behind us now. Okay? So you can see these going this way. Not only that, relative times can work the same way. Think of two times coming toward one. Which one precedes the other? Thanksgiving precedes Christmas. Thanksgiving comes first. Right? Christmas follows. Okay? So you can see that that as you go along, as times go along, the language fits it, but the reasoning fits it too. Now, in this case, there's a figure ground distinction. I'm the ground, right? I'm the observer. The times are the figures. They are moving relative to the ground. Here, they're moving relative to me. Now there's another metaphor for time where figure and ground are reversed. These are called figure ground reversals or duals. Okay? There's one in which time is a landscape. It's a path on the ground. You're moving along time. Times are points on the ground. And I'm moving, and the points on the ground are the figures, are the ground. I'm the figure. Okay? So, you can talk about things like being on time, being within a certain amount of time, as if there's an area. Okay? You can also talk about, you can say, not only Christmas is coming up on us, but we are coming up on Christmas. We're approaching Christmas. Right? So you have two different metaphors. Either Christmas is approaching us, or we're approaching Christmas, depending upon which metaphor you use. Same words, approach and come up on. Same words with the opposite subject and object, but different metaphors. Not only that, you can have metaphorical ambiguity with these two metaphors. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have scheduled a meeting on Wednesday. We're to have a meeting on Wednesday. We can say, and someone says, let's move the meeting ahead 2 days. When is the meeting? How many people say Monday? How many people say Friday? We don't have, nobody wants to volunteer. Okay. It turns out it's ambiguous. It could she's moving to Stanford next year. And she did a set of experiments to show that this metaphor is psychologically real. The first thing she did was, in a laboratory, she had little movies in which she would show either things coming towards you or had a camera showing you moving ahead with you holding the camera and seeing what happens when you move ahead. And she would show a little film clip, and then she would ask the question. She would say, there's a meeting scheduled on Wednesday. The meeting is being moved ahead. When is the meeting? And if you have things moving towards you, visually, spatially, in this field, you get one answer. And if you have you moving forward, you get another answer. So if you're moving forward, the answer is Friday. This is moving forward, the answer is Monday. Okay? Then she did a clever experiment. She went to San Francisco Airport, where there were planes coming in and people waiting for the planes. And she asked the people on the planes and the people waiting for the planes. Okay? So for the people waiting for the planes, you say, okay, there's a meeting scheduled for Wednesday. We're going to move it ahead. When is the meeting? Okay? And as people coming on the planes, if they just came off the planes, she'd ask them after they came off the planes, same question. Okay? People came off the planes, said Friday, the other people said Monday. Okay? This is a real effect. This really happens. Metaphors are part of cognition. They're part of the way you think, and they're part of the way you reason. You reason in terms of metaphors. And the words are guides to metaphors and imperfect guides. Okay, because they can be ambiguous. Okay. So that's the next lesson we learn. They are real. They guide your reasoning. We think in terms of them. And the words lead you to this mode of thought, but the mode of thought isn't in the words. The meaning is not in the words. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do next is give you a sense of the complexity of the system and the way it's embodied. So what I would like to do is take some examples from Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, a monster book. And this is from a study of anger. Zoltán Krivicek, a great Hungarian linguist. I will tell you about Zoltán. Zoltán is a wonderful person. He decided about 15 years ago that he wanted to study, more than 15, almost 20 years ago, he wanted to study emotions. But he got onto it in an interesting way. As a linguist in Hungary, as a professor, the professor's salaries were very, very low. So he had to do other work. Now, luckily, he had other skills. One skill he had was that he was a championship water polo player. He's, huge man, very strong. He was on the European Championship water polo team and was a hero, a national hero in Hungary for water polo. I would walk around Budapest with him, and all the women would throw themselves at his feet. Be recognized everywhere. Then he would He also knew English very well, so he would dub movies that were translated into Hungarian. But even then, he couldn't earn much of a living there. So he had another profession, which was to make up idiom dictionaries. And he tried to make up an idiom dictionary of English, and while he was on the letter A, he got to the word anger. And he came upon a long, long list of idioms. And they look like this. Let's see. He lost his cool. She was looking daggers at me. I almost burst a blood vessel. It all means you're getting angry, right? He was foaming at the mouth. You're making my blood boil. He's wrestling with his anger. He's on a short fuse. He's letting off steam. Don't get a hernia. Keep a grip on yourself. Don't fly off the handle. When I told him, he blew up. He channeled his anger into something constructive. He was red with anger. He was blue in the face. He appeased his anger. He was doing a slow burn. She kept bugging me, and so on. He came up with 300 of these in English and decided to apply for a grant to do research on these with me, because he had read Metaphors We Live By. He didn't tell me. He just showed up in my office one day and said, I want to study anger. And I looked up and said, okay. Now, Zoltan, being a professional athlete, was very disciplined. He wanted to account for every single idiom. And he would show up at my house early in the morning and say, time to start studying idioms. Right? And this article took us 9 months to do, to figure out the system. It's not easy to do this research. It took us 2 people 9 months. Now, when you get to the system and you finally begin to see it, what you discover is that it is embodied. It turns out at the same time, I happened to be reading the work of Paul Ekman, who is a friend of mine, who is the world's expert on the physiology of emotions. And he had done some studies the previous year on the physiology of anger, as well as fear and some other metaphors. When you get angry, your actual skin temperature rises 0.4 of a degree Fahrenheit. When you get angry, your blood pressure goes up. Your heartbeat rate increases. When you get angry, you don't see as clearly as you otherwise would. Your perception is made less good. And when you get angry, it's slightly harder to control your body in fine motor movements. Okay? That's the physiology of anger. When you get, for example, when you get afraid, your temperature goes down about 0.5 degree. That's why you're frozen with fear. Okay? The metaphors are based on the body. And the way this works is this. By the way, there's also a system of metonymies. So with metonymies, you have I haven't talked about metonymy yet, so let me stop and talk a little about metonymy and then come to metonymies for these cases. If you go to frame semantics, and we look at a frame, suppose you think of the frame semantics for a restaurant. You go into a restaurant, and they seat you at a table, and a waitress or a waiter comes over and gives you a menu, and you order some food, and there's food you have, and then you have to, you eat the food, you pay at the end, and so on. And the roles are customer, waiter or waitress, the dish you ordered, that is your food, the money you pay, and so on. And then there's a scenario for doing this. Now, in America, one waitress can say to another waitress, "The hamburger left without paying." Okay? Or here, the baozi left without paying. Okay. Or table 6 left without paying, because the table is part of this. That is, one part of a frame can stand for another part of the frame for reference. Okay? Well, given what you know, the implicit unconscious knowledge that you have about your own physiology of anger, you can have metonymies for being angry. Like, don't get hot under the collar. Means don't get angry. Or he's a hothead. Right? Means he gets angry easily, and so on. Or the thing about don't burst a blood vessel. Means the blood pressure is going up, so the increase in blood pressure stands for the anger. So there are a whole lot of cases like that. He's red with anger, scarlet with rage. Or agitation. He's shaking with anger. He's hopping mad. In English, you have expression, hopping mad, as if boom, 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 boom. He's so agitated that he's hopping. He was quivering with rage. He's all worked up, and so on. He's upset. These are metonymies of the bodily state for the anger state. Okay? Now, or things like he's blind with rage, because you can't see as well. He was so mad he couldn't see straight. Right? That is, he couldn't see accurately. So you have a metonymy there. Now, in addition to this, there are metaphors. And there's a whole system of metaphors for anger. And here's how they work. There's one metaphor that anger is heat in general. And this metaphor has two special cases, two framings for heat. That is, in one framing for heat, the heat, there's like a fluid in a container. Think of soup in a pot, or or something in a furnace, oil in a furnace or something, in which you have a closed container and fluid, and the container is being heated, and the fluid is being heated. Okay? And that's where you can say, he made my blood boil. Okay? Or he's letting off steam. To let off steam means the steam is coming out and it's less likely to explode. If you keep it in, it will explode, and that means releasing means getting very angry with someone, losing control. So exploding is losing control. Now, when you look at this, you have stages of in heating containers. You heat a liquid, and you can say, you can let it simmer at a slow, suppose you're cooking soup. You put it on a low heat, and it simmers. Say, he's been simmering for a long time. Sort of getting low level of anger for a long time. Right? Or, if someone's very angry, you can say, simmer down, get less angry. Simmer down. You can let him stew, which is low simmer for a long time. Somebody's angry, let him stew, let him cook for a long time. Okay. Now, when the intensity of the heat, if you put liquid in a container, you have more and more heat, you start to get boiling, and when it boils, the liquid goes up. So you get things like his anger welled up inside of him. He could feel his gorge rising. We got a rise out of him. His anger kept building up inside him. He was in a towering rage. right? So there you see the going up. When you heat liquid intensely, it produces steam. So he got all steamed up. He was fuming, letting off steam. Now, if you close the container, you close the pot, you heat it up, you can have things like it can start to burst. So you can be bursting with anger. You could say, I could barely contain my rage. I couldn't keep it in any longer. Okay? Then, if you try to keep this pot closed and it's boiling and boiling and boiling, it can explode. And so you can say, he exploded with anger. Okay? He blew up. He had an outburst. And then there are special cases. So, one special case is from a car, from a piston. He blew a gasket. Gasket is the little ring around the top of a piston. So when it gets too much pressure, the ring bursts. He blew a gasket. A volcano, she erupted. Electricity, I blew a fuse. Explosives, she's on a short fuse. Bomb, that really set me off. Okay? Those are kinds of explosions. And then when you have an explosion of this sort of pot with liquid in it, the liquid comes out. So his anger finally came out. And things like smoke was pouring out of his ears. Okay? So what you have is a very rich understanding of the heating of a fluid in a container. And that maps onto being angry. And there are stages of the heating and reasoning about it that maps onto reasoning about anger. Okay. Now, that's one case. Just of anger is heat. But there's another case of anger is heat, and that is fire. And it's a different metaphor. It has different language. There's a different frame for fire. So, think about the frame for fire. You have a thing that's burning, wood, let's say. And as the wood burns, it gets consumed. The wood disappears. It's consumed as it burns. So someone can be consumed with anger. Okay? And the cause of the fire is the cause of the anger. So those can be inflammatory remarks. Things that inflammatory means causing fire. Okay? You can inflame the situation, make people more angry. Okay? And many, many others. His insincere apology added fuel to the fire, made the other person more angry. And you can say, boy, am I burned up. He's been smoldering for days, and so on. So, here you have a general metaphor. Metaphors occurring at certain levels. A general metaphor, anger is heat, that is motivated by the physiology. Then you have two special cases, two frames about heat. One frame for heat is the liquid in the container being heated. The other is fire. Two different frames. They both map to anger, but they are different metaphors because they are different mappings. And then each of them gives rise to language. One has things like, you make my blood boil. The other is, I'm burned up. Right? Different metaphors. I'm consumed with anger on the fire one. He's letting off steam in the other one. Right? Different conceptual mappings. The language is sorted by each of them, and then you reason differently depending on that. In one you explode. In the other one you can set people on fire. You can spread the fire. Okay, both dangerous, but in different ways. Now, those are not the only metaphors for anger. There are others. So let me try to give you a sense of the range. I won't go through it in full detail. But anger can be seen as insanity. He's mad. The word mad means insane. Okay? When I touched him, he went crazy. One more complaint and I'll go berserk. He went out of his mind. He went bonkers. He's in an insane rage. Insane rage. If anything else goes wrong, I'll get hysterical. Right? Anger is insanity. When my mother finds out, she'll have a fit. He's fit to be tied. He's going to throw a tantrum. And then you get violent, frustrated behavior, insane behavior, standing for anger. He's tearing his hair out, banging his head against the wall, climbing the walls. So, insane behavior, standing for anger. Then you have another one. Anger can be an opponent that you struggle against, because people try to control their anger. So in that case, you can be struggling with your anger, battling your anger, fighting back your anger, wrestling with your anger. You can be seized by anger. You can take control of your anger, surrender to your anger, yield to your anger, be overcome by anger, appease your anger, and so on. Then there's anger is a dangerous animal. He has a ferocious temper, a fierce temper. It's dangerous to arouse, wake up his anger. Right? He has a monstrous temper. My favorite is he unleashed his anger. He took the leash off and let it go. He unleashed his anger. His anger is insatiable. It'll keep eating up people. And things like, you have there's a wonderful one for China. There's a dragon image. He was breathing fire. Okay. Now, and in general also, you get things like he was bristling with anger, got his hackles up. That is, when you have a dangerous animal that is dangerous, their hair stands on end. So you get bristling with anger, baring his teeth, ruffled her feathers, snapping, growling, snarling, animal behavior. Okay, now, what do we learn from this? First, for an important concept like anger, you don't just have one metaphor, you have a system of metaphors. And the system can have levels. You can have a level of anger is heat with two special cases, which are different mappings, and therefore different metaphors. Anger is heat is based directly on the physiology, but the frame of heating something in a container is not. That is, that's a special frame, a special kind of use of heat. So, given something that is based on the physiology, you can then extend that to something that isn't directly based on the physiology. What about anger is insanity? Why? Because what marks insanity is loss of control. And that's part of being angry. Loss of control. What are other cases of loss of control? Wild animals. Animals going wild. And so on. So what you find, and also, if you're trying to, people are supposed to stay in control, so they try to stay in control, and that's seen as wrestling with your anger. It's like fighting someone. So what you find is that the metaphor system is there for a purpose. I mean, it's there for a reason, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In fact, let me do that now. One of the metaphors that we found in Metaphors We Live By was that theories are buildings. So you have things like we laid the foundation for that theory, or that theory has weak foundations, or the theory is built on solid facts. What is the ground for that theory? Is it built on solid ground? The theory can crumble. You can prop up your theory, and so on. Now, when you actually look at this in detail, it turns out certain parts of the building are mapped onto theories. The ground, the foundation, the walls, anything that holds up the walls, the buttresses, you can buttress your theory. Buttress holds up the walls, and that's all. There's no paint in the theory. You don't have the electric lights of your theory. You don't have the plumbing of your theory, the floor of your theory. Look around the building. Most of the things aren't there. Okay? The air conditioning of your theory, nothing. Okay? Now, why is it that it's so small? Why are only some things mapped and not others? Okay? It's a fact that it works this way. And what do theories have to do with buildings? Why should theories have anything to do at all with buildings? Okay, these are the questions asked by a student of mine named Joe Grady, who wrote a very interesting dissertation based on observations like this. And what he discovered was the following, that there really are other more basic metaphors than theories or buildings that the theories or buildings metaphor is made up of. He discovered that there are what are called primary or primitive metaphors. And that the primitive metaphors, the primary ones, are all based in actual experience. Okay? And that they can be put together in various ways. And when you put them together, it becomes less obvious what the experience is. So let me explain. When he looked at theories or buildings, and he looked at the words used, like crumble and foundation and so on, he found the same words were used in other metaphors. There's a metaphor that a society is a building. And the society has to have a strong foundation or a weak foundation. It can crumble. You can try to prop up the society or fix the foundations of the society. Okay? Same words for society. Why should you have the same words for societies and theories? Seems strange. He got the idea for the answer from a speech by the first George Bush during the Gulf War in 1991. In that speech, Bush got up there, the other Bush, and said of Saddam Hussein's invasion, he said, "This will not stand." He used the word stand. This will not stand means it will not persist. Means there's a metaphor that says that persisting over time is standing erect. And you can see why. It's like flowers come out of the ground, they persist over time, they stand erect, and then they die, they go into the ground. Or trees, or buildings themselves, and so on. People. Right? Things that are persisting over time typically stand erect. When they cease to persist over time, they go down. Now, so that's one part. There's another metaphor he noticed, which is that an organizational structure is a physical structure. You understand an organization in terms of a physical structure, and that makes sense because if you're looking at an object and you're examining it, you see the way it's organized by looking at its physical structure. So its physical structure, its organizational structure is revealed by its physical structure. Now, given those two metaphors, what happens when you put them together? You bind them together and you get an organizational structure that persists over time is a physical structure that remains erect, remains tall, and stands up. Now, what is an organizational structure that persists over time? 1, a society. 2, a theory. Physical structure that remains erect is a building. So what you have is a whole structure of basic metaphors that are being fit together as pieces, like building blocks, to make other metaphors. And you have a general metaphor that a physical structure that remains erect, that an organizational structure that persists over time is a physical structure that remains erect, and then special cases are societies and buildings. What that means is that the conceptual structure of metaphor is being put together in blocks, just as all other conceptual structure is being put together. Conceptual structure means taking pieces and putting them together. Combining them, you combine frames. So similarly, you can have primitive metaphors and you combine them into bigger metaphors. Okay? Now, this work was done in 1997 by Grady. And by coincidence, there were 2 other dissertations done by students at Berkeley in 1997 on metaphor. One was by Grady's best friend, Christopher Johnson, and he studied metaphor acquisition by children. And here's what he found. He found that, well, here's the way he went about it. He said, it's hard to study this, but he said, we have a vast number of computer archives of all of the records of child language acquisition that have been done by researchers. He says, let's take a metaphor, like knowing is seeing. I see what you're getting at. It's clear to me, and so on. Let's take that metaphor, knowing is seeing, and then do something interesting. Let's look up the word see for all children at each age and find out what they were saying at each age with the word see, what the sentences were. And then he discovered a generalization. The first sentences are all non-metaphorical, literal. See daddy, see doggy. Okay? Then there's a stage in which knowing and seeing come together, and the grammar of seeing, of knowing, fits the word see. So you can say, see daddy come in, see what I spilled. Okay? So knowing and seeing come together. Then there's a further stage of metaphor. See what I mean. Okay? So what he says is that there's this pre-condition where the knowing, the target domain and the source domain of the metaphor occur together in the child's experience. And that is necessary for later metaphor. Okay? So that's his finding. Now, the third dissertation explains the first 2. The third one was a dissertation by Srini Narayanan, and he did much more than this, but part of the dissertation had to do with a neural theory of metaphor. He worked on neural computation, and he was working on a very difficult problem, and I'll tell you later on what his problem was. But part of it required setting up a computational model of how metaphor works. And in this, he observed first that the source and target domains for basic metaphors that we have, like more is up, are in different parts of the brain. Quantity is computed in one part of the brain where you compute number, and verticality is computed in another part of the brain which has to do with both balance and with vision, where those are brought together. So the idea is that verticality and number are in different parts of the brain. How would you get a metaphor linking them? Well, if you experience why is more is up because every time you pour water into a glass, the level goes up. Every time you put books down, the level goes up, right? That is, in general, putting more things means higher level. Every day of your life, there's a correlation. You pour the water in the glass, you see there's more water, and it's higher. Okay? Two parts of your brain are activated together, over and over again. When that happens, neural connections are formed between them. The way the mechanism, I won't go into the mechanism has to do with strengthening the synapses between those two parts of the brain, so that connections get formed. The slogan that neuroscientists have is, neurons that fire together wire together. They form strong connections. Those connections are the metaphorical mappings, so that when one part of the brain is activated, the corresponding part of the other one is activated. Verticality, quantity. Okay? They are the metaphors. The metaphors are physically there in your brain according to Narayanan. Now, how does this explain Christopher Johnson's results about acquisition? He says, when knowing and seeing occur together, where there's seeing activated and knowing activated, then you learn connections, and then you get the metaphor. How does this explain Brady's observation about primitive metaphors, about primaries? Brady studied over 100 different primaries, and what he found was, in every case, when you had two experiences that came together in the life of a child, the life of everybody, what happened was that they formed primitive metaphors. So, for example, take the metaphors for time, where time is a moving object or you're moving over time. In general, what is time in your brain? Time has to do with the firing of neurons. Every 40 times, every second, there is a pulse that goes through your brain, from the brain stem, throughout the rest of the brain. It times the rest of your brain. It allows you, it's like a clock for your brain. And everything else is timed relative to that. Time has to do with the relationship between an event and other regular events. For example, the sun going around regularly, or water dripping regularly, or a watch ticking regularly. That is, one event relative to another event gives you time. Then, when that happens in the brain and you see someone moving towards you, you notice the passing of time, or when you're moving relative to someone else. So what's going on there is everybody is going to understand time as a moving object, or time as you moving relative to someone else, because everyone has the same experiences. What about anger? Anger is heat, or anger is activation around the world, or anger is an increase of pressure inside. You have, for example, Chinese has an expression of having too much qi for anger, right? Which is too much internal energy. Okay? Okay. So what happens is people notice from the physiology that the physiology corresponds to the state of anger, and you get metaphors linking them. You get neural connections linking them. So the idea here is that the universal metaphors are the metaphors that arise mostly in childhood, maybe not all in childhood, but mostly in childhood, just by living in the world. They don't require language. They are pre-linguistic. That the experience of bringing together the source and target domains of the primitives, of the primitive metaphors only, of those primitives, give rise to neural connections for those metaphors and create them, and then the language can come along, see what I mean. Okay? Now, or he's boiling mad. What's interesting about this is that this sets up a system of hundreds of primitive metaphors that you learn automatically just by living. Just by going around the world every day, living your life as a child, happily doing whatever children do, you're going to learn hundreds of metaphors. We'll go through more of them this afternoon. Okay? Then, but those are only the simple, primitive ones. Then they fit together into larger ones, like theories or buildings. Theories or buildings that's not learned in that way. That's a more complicated, elaborate one. What is learned in that way is that things that persisting over time is standing erect. Because little children go around seeing flowers and trees and people persisting over time and standing erect. Right? What is learned is that organizational structure is physical structure because little kids are always looking at things and examining them and looking at the way they're organized. Okay? As a child goes around his or her everyday life, constantly different parts of the brain are regularly activated together. When they're regularly activated together, they're going to learn neural connections between them, which are the metaphors. And that is how metaphor systems get established, but only systems of the primaries. And then culture, on top of that, allows you to put the primaries together to form larger and larger, more complicated metaphors, which we will discuss in very great detail this afternoon. Okay? So I'm going to stop here.